Hello, folks. You are listening to Race Matters, and I am Eddie Carson, the host of this show. You're listening to Race Matters here at WJOP-LP, Joppa Radio, Newburyport, Massachusetts. You can find Race Matters on YouTube, on SoundCloud, and you can find it on my website at professorcarson.com. As we do every week, we delve into the nomenclature, thinking about elements of race, class, culture, society, and all those other things that allow us to kind of coalesce into conversations about the world and society as it is, maybe our hopefulness and the way it might be. People, I have a treat for you. I am really excited about our guest today. We have Professor David Kaiser joining us here. And I'll just say a little bit about David before I bring him into the fold of our conversation and everything. David attended Harvard University, graduating with a BA in history. He then spent several years there, earning a PhD in history. I will say one of the fascinating things that I do know about Professor Kaiser, not to embarrass him, is that his dissertation when working on towards his PhD was quite a tome, and he did it in 3 years, which is in many ways just unheard of, especially seeing that most folks spend almost 10 years in PhD programs these days. Once he finished at Harvard, he was a professor on the faculty at Harvard for a number of years. We'll probably explore some of the politics that really kind of delved into Harvard's history department back then, and things have been written about that on various different accounts. After Harvard, he interviewed and landed in the Department of History. It was history, and I'm going to get this wrong, but I want to say it was history. And David, I got to bring you in here. Help me out. It's one more department.
History and philosophy.
That's a history and philosophy at Carnegie Mellon University.
There you go.
Pittsburgh. Great institution. I was on their campus this past summer. Afterwards, he was at the United States Naval War Naval War College, and then at Williams College here in Massachusetts. A couple other things I want to say about Brother Kaiser here. He's just a brilliant intellectual, a scholar. He is a wonderful historian, someone who's written countless books. His works include Economic Diplomacy and the Origins of the Second World War, Postmodern, New Evidence in a Case of Sacco and Vanzetti, which I found absolutely fascinating. I don't know if we'll have time to delve into that, but I will say it was interesting, particularly reading about how he got a hold of some of the documents and the archival stuff, and how he really drove the work on that. Politics and War, European Conflict, from Philip II to Hitler, and Epic Season, the 1948 American League pennant race. He's written much more than that, and I can go on and on and on. But I want to say this, and I want to put a plug in, and I think it'll come up a little bit in our conversations too. I got to know Professor Kaiser primarily through his autobiography, A Life in History, published in 2018. And this work really combines an account of Kaiser's own life, career, as a commentary on changes, on academia, as a historian, as a father, husband, friend, community member, just a really good social person. And so I'm just going to place his book up here, A Life in History. Wonderful, wonderful work. And I got to do this. And let me tell you, I read it like a kid in a candy store, just marveled by the wonderful narratives that's there. So I'm going to stop, pause, and welcome Professor Kaiser to the fold. Welcome to Race Matters, my friend.
I'm delighted to be here, Eddie, and thank you for that introduction. That's going to be a challenge to live up to it, but I will do my best for you and your listeners.
I appreciate it, my friend. Folks, we're going to delve in a little bit into Professor Kaiser's background and his work. I do want to say one of the things that really intrigued me about David Kaiser in his book is the fact that really, right, being a product coming out of Loomis Chaffee, going on into the Ivy Leagues, becoming a renowned professor, and doing some of the things that he has done, he touched on a number of different cultural phenomenons that deals with race and gender in his book. And I was really intrigued by that stuff because, again, in folks who've listened to Race Matters, that's my passion that's there. And we want to touch on some of that stuff too. But I want to ask this question to you, my friend. I want to go ahead and start off by saying you've had a distinguished career as a teacher, a scholar, a researcher, and all of it has not been easy as you face internalized political issues during your early years at Harvard. Can you speak to what some have called the hard years of Harvard's history department that you were a part of?
Sure. Let me begin by putting it in the broadest possible context. I got my degree in 1976, having entered graduate school in 1971. And actually, in many ways, that remains the happiest period of my life until I had to find a job. Now, I couldn't have been happier about the work I was doing, the people I was with, my personal life, living in Cambridge at that point, etc. But I was facing a difficult demographic situation. The big expansion of higher education in the US was in the 50s and early 60s. And that had created a big demand for faculty members. And it was easy to get a job. But by the time I was on the market in 1975, 76, that was over. Suddenly, there was a huge surplus of graduate students. There were very few jobs. And also, the fashion in history was already turning against high-level political history and diplomatic history, which is what I was in. Now, I have thought a lot, as you know, both then and later, about my junior faculty member experience. And certain things became clear to me writing the book. And actually, I may be able to go into them a little more. Not things about me, but about the key actors. To begin with, the Harvard History Department was basically split into European historians and American historians. The catch, from my point of view, was that the only leading senior faculty diplomatic historian was Ernest May, who was an American historian primarily, although he knew European diplomacy too. And he had been my thesis advisor. And my thesis was about economic diplomacy and the origins of the Second World War. It was about Europe, not America. American history had been my original love as a kid, and I eventually returned to it, but not then. Now, what happened was, as I was finishing my dissertation in 75, 76, he got a grant in DC to study the arms race, and he got half time for the next year at Harvard. So he got the authorization to hire somebody as a lecturer, one-year position, to share his teaching. And I wound up getting that post. And so I was off and running. And that was going very well right off the bat. I mean, I gave some lectures in the first fall. They went well. And he was hoping to do what he had done with some other students to get me a 5-year assistant professorship. And suddenly he ran into resistance, and this became a political struggle. And now what I can talk about is what had been going on in the European history side of the department, which had nothing to do with me, but which had a huge impact on how things went for me. And it involved two of the leading figures in that department, and both of whom are now dead. Everybody involved in this story practically is dead except me. But anyway, the first one was H. Stuart Hughes, who was an intellectual historian, old line Yankee. His grandfather had been Chief Justice of the U.S. and nearly elected president. A very kind of amusing WASP type, but and not a great scholar. He wrote several books, which were decent books, but not groundbreaking. But an outstanding lecturer teaching European intellectual history, and as I said in the book, and very good in the classroom. And I thought he had a great sense of what being a Harvard professor was about. And he had read something I'd written as an undergraduate. He, like me, he had taught the undergraduate colloquium as I was in. He certainly would have been an ally. But things were going on in his life, to wit. He had gotten a divorce sometime around 1960, I think. I don't know. And then he had fallen in love with a graduate student and he married her. And he had gotten her a job in the department as an assistant professor. Now, in 1970, three assistant professors came up for tenure. And it was unheard of for assistant professors, almost unheard of for assistant professors to get tenure at that point. But these three did get it, including a relatively young historian of France named Patrice Higonnet, who had written one short book, A Village Study. Those were fashionable at the time. And the other two were not in Europe per se, but I won't go into them. Neither one of them had a distinguished scholarly record later. Higonnet did write some more books, but they were short books. But anyway, now I am now convinced that Hughes was largely responsible for them getting tenure. And the reason was that he wanted to establish a precedent so that when his now wife came up for tenure a few years later, there would be a strong case for her. Well, she did come up a few years later, and I don't think her credentials were that strong, and she didn't get it. And Hughes took umbrage at this and arranged a deal for both of them to go to the University of California in San Diego. So he was gone at the end of 1975, I think. Another senior European was an economic historian named David Landis, who I had gotten to know a little bit, and he had come to the history colloquium. He heard me give a presentation, and he appreciated the kind of things I had done. And I think he really would have appreciated economic diplomacy. He got into a fight with the department about a year later because the American historians had their own center, the Charles Warren Center, and it was well endowed. And basically, they were paying themselves extra salary out of the Warren Center as research grants. And he resented that. And he suddenly decided to leave the department and switch to the economics department. So within 2 years, really the two leading European historians, both of whom I know thought highly of me, were gone. And when the question of making me an assistant professor came up, Patrice Higonnet decided to throw his weight around for the first time, and he had other ideas for those appointments. And that's as much as I'm going to say about all that now. If anybody's really interested, they can get a hold of A Life in History and get the whole detailed story, which kept me on tenterhooks for 2 or 3 years, actually, and because they couldn't make a decision on what to do. And eventually I had to point out that Higonnet had promised that I was going to get the job under certain circumstances. And then those circumstances took place and he tried to renege. And I was able to call on some friends who stood up for me. And in the end, I got a 3-year appointment and was told that that was all there was going to be. And then they stuck to that. And then for some reason, then I started, giving my own lecture course. It was very successful. And at the beginning of the 4th year, I went to a new chairman and I said, well, could I be renewed? And for some reason, he said, no, you can't be renewed, but we can consider you for a higher position. And by that time, the dissertation had been accepted as a book. It wasn't out yet, but it was going to be.
Princeton University, right?
That's right, by Princeton University Press. But there were 4 or 5 of us who were up for that at the same time, and only one made it, and he had actually already finished a second book. So by that time, I had 100 people in one lecture course. I'd started another lecture course. I was a figure of some note among the undergraduates, but none of that mattered. So that was the end of my 4 years at Harvard, which really ran the gamut from the most intense satisfaction to extreme stress. And then I did land at Carnegie Mellon, which is a whole other story. So this is a fairly typical story in a lot of ways about academia, where egos, personal problems, jealousies plays such an enormous role. And it's very sad. And that leads me to one of my big life lessons, which I shared about 20 years ago, I think it was, with an older historian, very nice guy, very accomplished, named Robert Dallek. He wrote biographies of Johnson and Kennedy and a lot more. and he's still alive. I don't know how he's doing, but anyway, I met him in an archive and got to know him well, and I said, Bob, I think I figured out what's wrong with our profession. There's so few of us who really enjoy it. And without a moment's hesitation, he said, "Oh, you are so right." He said, I mean, it was not a new thought to him, and I still think that's true.
That I
Yeah,
mean, my friend, that's a fascinating point. And I sit here and I listen to you, and I can hear that energy and enjoy it. And I got to be honest with you, I'm thinking that's one of the things that captivated me about your story, the fact that you are someone who loves history. And I just,
that's
and
right.
for me, as someone who loves history, and we do different things historically,
Yes.
um, but yet that passion just comes across in so many ways. I remember, and I'm going to ask you this question. I remember when I was a undergrad and grad.
Where was that? Where was that, may I ask? I'm almost curious
Oh,
about
so I
that.
was in mid 90s.
No, where?
Oh, I went to a school, Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas.
Okay, is that an HBC?
It is not. Yeah, I
Oh,
had.
it's not. Oh,
It is
okay,
not.
okay,
Ooh, it
okay,
is. It
okay.
is not. But one of the things I remember when I was an undergrad and I was thinking about stuff is one of my advisors said, you know, Eddie, let me tell you about the future of in higher education and history, and
Hmm.
it's challenging. And then so I listened and all of this stuff about what the job market and everything's looking like. And so I remember coming across a study. So I'm going to ask you his name. He was a former president at Harvard who predicted a brighter future that never came to fruition. And I have no idea.
Was that Derek Bach?
Derek Bach, thank you.
Yeah,
That's
that's the kind of thing he would have done.
he
Yes,
did
but
it.
no, it hasn't worked out that way.
No,
No,
not even
no.
close. I remember reading some study, some work from Derek Bach, and I think there are a couple of things in the Chronicle of Higher Education when I was an
Yeah,
undergrad. I was like, you know what? I don't know. And then I started getting the sense that it's going to
right.
become more challenging. Whereas I remember recent numbers I read, I want to say less than 30% of professors are actually tenured.
Oh yeah.
And like 46 are adjuncts, and getting a job in
Yeah.
higher education is just almost
Oh, I
impossible.
know. I know. And in fact, it's been recently been brought home to me that Harvard is now using adjuncts extensively. They don't call them adjuncts. They call them lecturers, but they're on temporary contracts without any tenure possibility. And that sounds like an adjunct to me. By the way, Eddie, I do want to mention, you probably noticed this too. There is one historical figure, apparently, in which we both have a very intense interest.
Oh, who is that?
W.E.B. Du Bois.
So you pointed him, you brought him up in your book. Trust me, I caught that.
I did indeed. Yes. Yes. I was very excited to discover him. And actually, my favorite book of his is one of his autobiographies, Dusk to Dawn.
Yes, yes.
And he also, well, he had to abandon academics. And he makes it very clear that the main reason he had to do that was Booker T. Washington, who didn't like
Interesting.
him. Oh, yes. And in fact, there's a very striking passage in that book, which I was paraphrased as saying the situation at the beginning of the 20th century was that no black man could get anything from any other black man or any white man if Booker T. Washington didn't want him to have it.
That's
And
true.
yeah, that's right. And that was, he says, that was one of the reasons I broke with him.
I mean,
Um,
and
yeah,
of course, Booker T. Washington, right, part of that Tuskegee machine. They're like
that's
gangsters
right.
back then,
That's
the
right. That's
mob,
right.
control stuff. And I will say, and not to go down this road on Du Bois because we'd be here forever doing stuff I don't want to do.
Right.
But it's interesting that I remember when he left the NAACP and he landed with Clark University or Clark Atlanta University.
Yeah.
And then even the politics there got to a point where he was like, I'm going to go back to the NAACP. And that's when that brother was just becoming radical in different ways too. But I digress.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I started it, but let's get back to
Oh,
where you were
I
going.
love you.
Okay.
I love you brought that brother up. So I recently had Cornell West on this show, and I appreciate you
Yeah.
sharing with me the podcast he was on with, and I know you have connections with them with John McWhorter, Glenn Lowry, uh,
With Glenn,
with
not with
Glenn.
John, but
Yeah,
yeah,
not
right.
John, with
Yeah.
Glenn.
I
And
haven't met John. Yeah.
George. George is escaping me, but I know
I
Cornell.
can't remember that guy's name, but yeah, I
They
know who you're
do,
talking about.
they do a lot of stuff
Yeah.
with Cornell, and again, I have lots of issues with three out of the four of them, and particularly, actually, at least Glenn tells you who he is. John pretends to tell you who he is, and I won't get into that because that's my
I
only.
don't know about that, but okay. All
That-
right.
that's
Yeah.
that's fine, you know.
Yeah.
So I had Cornell West on this show, and he was a product of Harvard's
Yeah.
1960s effort to hire more faculty of
Yeah.
color, recruit students of colors, build the African American Studies department. What do you recall about those days at Harvard and throughout the country? And then let me
Well, I don't know where to begin, but well, you raised the whole question of Black studies, African American studies, etc. And again, that was my senior year, which was the year of the Great Revolution at Harvard and the strike. And I had read too much Orwell to get seduced by this new radical movement, but I was watching it, and there were those, and not only established white scholars who questioned the wisdom of setting up a separate department. And in fact, I believe that Nat Huggins, who was one of the first chairmen of that department, had very mixed feelings about it because he just thought that, yeah, we need more Black scholars, but they should be working in the established departments and doing what everybody else does there and pursuing that particular interest.
But not everyone was
And
doing
you,
that kind of stuff, though, right?
no, not at all. It's important. But and as I said, that was the reaction that I heard firsthand from the social psychologist Thomas Pettigrew, who was teaching the main race relations course at Harvard then, which was a great course. I mean, he was a liberal white Southerner from Richmond, Virginia, and very charismatic lecturer, and didn't mince any words about anything. But anyway, he said, they were saying, we need this department because so far there's no such thing as Black studies. And he said, he and several colleagues said, excuse me, what do you think I've been doing all my life? Right. And I also think as a historian, I don't mind saying this, it doesn't make any sense, I think, to study Black Americans in isolation from white Americans. Because the stories are just completely interconnected from day one until now. But anyway, that battle was resolved in a different direction. Cornell West is about 4 or 5 years younger than I am, so we didn't really overlap. And I only spoke to him once, very briefly. Actually, it was when he was giving a book talk in the Coop, and there was a book I wanted to get him interested in, so I showed it to him. I didn't make any progress on that, but he's a very charismatic guy, and he's contributed a lot. Now, again, he's very proud, okay? And now, this is incredible, but it's true. He was driven out of Harvard by Larry Summers.
2001, I think.
Yes. And at the same moment, this was all in the first year of Larry Summers, I was kept out of returning to Harvard, which some people in the history department wanted to, because Larry Summers announced that he wasn't going to allow anybody over 50 to be hired because people over 50 were extinct volcanoes. Now,
Larry
you and all
Summers said that. Wow.
that was published. Well, he stopped 2 appointments. Okay. And I think it was in government and in music. And this is while the history department was considering me. And it breaks in the Wall Street Journal and the Crimson that this is his policy. And apparently the history department took note because they hired one guy right out of graduate school and one guy was about 40. So that was the end of that. But what I was going to say was, if I had been a tenured professor and been cold on the carpet the way Cornel West was, um, my reaction would not have been to leave.
That always
My reaction would have been to say to Larry Summers, "Excuse me, you're not going to tell me how to be a history professor at Harvard. That's something I know about. You don't know about. So why don't you just mind your own business and I'll go back and do what I do best right now." But that's me, that's him. What
I
am I
mean,
going to say?
but
Right.
you bring up a good question because, or excuse me, a good point, because that's always confused me in a sense that someone who reaches the status of full professorship there, right?
Yeah.
You got Skip Gates, you're bringing in other folks building this revolutionary um,
Right.
department. I would have run Larry Summers out of Harvard. I mean, that's
Well, all he needed was a little patience because, as you may remember, Larry Summers did not last very long for a variety of reasons. I mean, he is somebody nobody can get along with for very long, it seems, and that caught up to him very quickly.
that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just strange. I want to go back to something you said though, and I remember. I mean, make sure I get his name right. Professor Pettigrew, is that correct?
Yes.
So I remember, and you pointed this out in your book, that he was this white brother from the South, Richmond, doing black studies, and I know he
Well, he didn't call it Black Studies. He
right.
called it
Well, okay,
race
yeah,
relations. Right.
right,
Right.
right. Yeah,
Okay.
they didn't
Yeah.
right. They didn't
Yeah.
name it that way,
Right.
but doing kind of African American history and
Yeah.
work, and he took it
Right.
personally that they were looking to move in a direction where they thought they needed to create an Afro American Studies department, and I remember him saying, "But I'm already doing that stuff." Because I also remember too, and again, I need you to correct me on this, and I know you will. You've done it already a few times, which I appreciate. That he's someone who would step forward and say, I'm not using the word African American. The Negroes like being called Negroes, and we need to hold on to their vernacular, their language, and there's no need for any of that other stuff. Am I
It
correct?
wasn't it wasn't quite like that,
Okay.
but you're close. I didn't remember that I put that in the book. That's funny. He was still using this was in the fall of 1968, right? And again, that lecture hall was packed. Um, and because the civil rights issues they were huge at that moment. We'd just been the King assassination and the riots and everything else. Uh, and he said, some of you may be wondering about my use of the word Negro instead of black. And I have no quarrel with anybody what they want to be called. However, it is a fact, polls show, that the majority of Negro Americans still prefer Negro. So that's what I'm going to say. And by the way, Eddie, I'm glad this has come up. With respect to what happened in the late 60s with the shift in the civil rights movement, I think there hasn't been enough attention to one angle of all that, which was that was a huge, sharp, generational conflict within the black community
Fair point.
between particularly the GI generation, the ones who had been good boys and girls, lived up to society standards, and had made tremendous progress, albeit often at a considerable psychological cost, and their children who were doing what children often do. Mom and dad, I'm not going to put up with that crap that you put up with. I mean, and actually, one incredible example of that in 1972 with the Olympics. Everybody remembers what happened in the 1968 Olympics
Yep.
with Carlson Smith. There was a similar thing in 72, though, when two of the medal winners, including the gold medal winner in the 400 meters, did not stand at attention and stood there talking and laughing during the playing of the national anthem. And they got kicked off the team for that. And one of them, Vince Matthews, who had won, wrote a book about all this, an autobiography. And he said that the first thing he did after walking off the stand was to call home. I think he was in Brooklyn. And his mother said, you shouldn't have done that. You should have stood at attention. And that was a very revealing moment, I think, about that intergenerational conflict.
I'm so glad you pointed that out, and I think that's a narrative in the story that I've heard briefly. I wouldn't say that I'm super versed, and I don't know if a lot of people know that. Of course, a lot of people know the Juan Carlos, John Smith. John Smith, yeah.
Right. Tommy Smith, no, Tommy
Tommy
Smith,
Smith
John
and
Carlos.
Carlos. That's
John
right. Thank
Carlos.
you.
Right.
Right. So they know those that narrative there too. But you said something a couple seconds ago, and I'd love for you just to briefly respond that you don't think you can do Black studies outside of the parameters of what I would call the ubiquity of whiteness that's there. I'd love for
That is not the way I would put it. Now
you.
these are ideological differences. Now, what I am saying is, I don't think you can understand the experience of Black Americans without paying any attention to white Americans, and vice versa. We've been in this together from the beginning, okay, for good or ill, in lots of different ways. And the best writing about slavery, I think, recognizes that too. Um, and we think of slavery as simply an oppressive institution, which it certainly was. But it was also a human institution, and like all human institutions, it was incredibly complex. And Eugene Genovese,
Yes.
a white leftist, brought that out beautifully in many ways in Roll Jordan Roll. But that's a rabbit hole maybe we don't want to go into. We could go on and on. But that's what I think. And again, I was okay. I grew up in the 50s and early 60s in this liberal, half Jewish household. My father was in and out of government. He was obsessed with politics his whole life. In that kind of environment, civil rights was the biggest domestic issue there was. And actually another thing that really gets my goat is when somebody like Hillary Clinton, an exact contemporary of mine, went to college just a few miles away, talking about her father and race, says he had the attitudes of his time and place. Translation: we all know all white people were racist back then. Well, I'm sorry, Hillary, I don't know that, because the white people I knew were not racist. In fact, they thought this was the biggest issue in the country at that time. So where you stand depends on where you sit, etc.
Oh, my friend, I appreciate you pointing that out. And I think it's a
Okay.
point, especially as we think about, your experiences, sitting around the table, hearing those conversations. And of course, we know from your book that your parents were, you've lived in a lot of different locations.
I lived in Africa for 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Your
During the
parents,
Kennedy years. Yeah.
in terms of thinking about foreign service, all of that stuff that's there. I want to take a second though, and I want to bring this back to you for a moment. And
Sure.
You're a diplomatic historian, and one of the things you've wrestled with, especially on your career trajectory, is that a lot of folks were not necessarily, and again, please correct anything I say, looking always for a diplomatic historian, but looking for someone who could, teach courses, right? Your background, especially your language, I believe, is in German.
Actually, my main first language was in French because I went to a French school.
That's
But
right.
I did learn German in graduate school to write my thesis. Yes.
And then again, right, dealing, going into the archives and everything too.
Yeah.
So, and again, one of the things we've exchanged via email, I picked up from your book, is, the place and the status of diplomatic history. I'll be the first to say I am definitely no scholar of diplomatic history. The biggest works that I've read that I found fascinating, and I'm going to give out a shout out to Professor Mark Elrod at the University of Central Arkansas for introducing me to the rise and the fall of the great powers by Paul Kennedy at Yale.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Right. And I believe you
Yes.
referenced him in your book.
Oh, I did. I reviewed that book.
Yeah,
Right.
right, that's right. And then of course, right, we know what Paul Kennedy's book, the biggest shot people took, which I'm like, okay, who else was predicting that? But I digress, the decline of the Soviet Union. But I absolutely love that book. It is one that I've even recently contemplated rereading. I have so many books to read that I get in trouble rereading books. And of course, Barbara Tuchman's Stillwell and American Experience in
Oh,
China.
yes. Oh, yes.
Um,
Yes.
Classic. I read that when I was an
Yes.
undergrad. And so
Okay.
I,
Yeah.
I say all this to say, what are your 21st century concerns? And I know you've blogged about this too, regarding global issues and the American first narrative as a diplomatic scholar.
Well, um, we've seen a movement into a whole new era in the last 35 years. That is to say, since the fall of communism. And for a while, we just thought that meant that America and the American way of doing things, the United States, our way of doing things, was going to be preeminent everywhere. And it hasn't turned out that way. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Now, the United States has now, under Trump, turned its back on the leadership role that it had for my whole lifetime, and I'm going to be 78 in a few weeks, and on the principles that it espoused, didn't always observe them, but it espoused. And it could be that we're moving into an era which will be dominated by regional powers, including us in our hemisphere. And Trump is already throwing his weight around, threatening to escalate in our hemisphere, although I don't expect much to come of that. But the Chinese, are threatening to be more aggressive. I don't know if it's going to happen or not about Taiwan. Russia is already being more aggressive, and they're being more in that. And the European Union is trying to figure out what to do. Now, we don't know what role war is going to play. I don't think we're headed for a new world war. We're headed for local wars. The other thing that's happening in Ukraine is that the way wars are fought is changing very rapidly, with drones taking over. And one thing that it looks to me that is going to give a big advantage to the defense, which may be a force for stability. In other words, the Chinese, if they really want to invade Taiwan or blockade Taiwan, but if they're going to lose a lot of ships to drones, I mean, they've really got to think about that. And we could lose ships to drones too. But we do seem to be in a completely new era. But the other big thing that's happened, I think, is that governments have gotten weaker relative to private interests. And you mentioned Politics and War, European Conflict from Philip II to Hitler, which I think was really my most ambitious book. That book, by the way, I was writing that book while Kennedy was writing The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers.
Okay.
And he beat me to the punch by several years with the publication. And I maybe made 1/100th of the money he made, but that's okay. Actually, that book, Politics and War, was the main selection of the History Book Club, which in those days was a fairly big deal.
Well, I'll make sure
I'm proud of that.
Get a copy of
But
that.
if you read The Rise and Fall, you would be fascinated, I think. And it's considerably shorter than Kennedy's because it's a completely different way of looking at it. Anyway, that starts out, the first of 4 sections of that book is about the period from about 1559 to 1659, which is a period of anarchy in most of Europe because of the power of the aristocracy. And then you see the state get stronger over the centuries until by the 20th century, the strongest states aren't European states and the Europeans can't compete with them. Now, though, I think states are getting weaker again, and this shows up in all kinds of ways. I mean, the fact that Elon Musk, a private individual, is supplying these critical satellites to militaries all over the world. And according to his biographer, I just read the biography, Musk was able to stop a big Ukrainian attack on the Russian fleet by denying them access to the satellites at a critical moment. I mean, that's a world historical event. So I don't know where we're going, but it's going to be a very different world. But that's connected to all sorts of other things that I'm talking about in the blog. In fact, the next blog is going to be about that. I've been slow to get around to it.
Well,
But and meanwhile, I mean, we've had this brush with nuclear war
yeah.
with India and Pakistan, where I remember two or three other wars, actually. So who knows what's going to happen with that, right?
It's interesting you mentioned India and Pakistan because I remember again I was like I think right out of high school, undergrad, somewhere in that region. And I remember thinking that there was going to be a nuclear war in India and Pakistan were going to start a nuclear war back in the mid 90s. Right. And again, yeah,
That's when Pakistan first exploded theirs. Yes, I think it was in the late 90s. Right. Yeah. Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
just frightening. And again,
And meanwhile, excuse me, international relations has been becoming very cruel in various areas, such as in the Middle East. And what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank is in a new phase, in a very depressing phase. Actually, we've already had very large population transfers as a result of wars, often started by us. Several million Iraqis left Iraq, and I think several million Syrians left Syria, and that's had all kinds of consequences. And now it does look to me as if this Israeli government may want to push the Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank. Uh, so we don't know where all this is going to go. Now, the peak period for that kind of thing was the period of the Second World War. And in fact, the biggest population transfer was of Germans after the Second World War, which was over 10 million. But I didn't want to live to see that come back, but apparently it may be. Yeah.
Professor Kaiser, this is fascinating. And folks who are just chiming in, this is Race Matters. I am the host, Eddie Carson. This is WJOPLP, Newburyport, Massachusetts. I am here with a renowned scholar, diplomatic historian, Professor David Kaiser, who is just really bringing an informative funk to the show, if I could use that language, right? It things that we don't oftentimes kind of let marinate, nor does it fully percolate on this show as we've kind of expanded and some topics beyond the domestic into the international. And I'm not qualified to have those conversations. And truthfully, many of my prior guests have not been, but to have an authority who is says a lot. That being said, Professor Kaiser, as you noted in your book, and I want to give another shout out and plug to it, a life in history, folks. And I really encourage you to give this a read, a fantastic work, I promise you. You've been around a lot of folks in academia for a long period of time, particularly during different iterations of the culture wars. And,
Wow.
I remember, you've had colleagues who've been, quite conservative to colleagues who've been Marxist scholars. And I got to tell you this, I find such the diversity of thought to be really healthy when we're talking about, various different ideological beliefs and how we think about history and everything. That being said, I do believe we're entering into an age, or we are in an age today where there's this McCarthy-like sense of navigating academic spaces, telling people what should and should not be there. And it's somewhat akin to the podcast with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter and Cornel West and that other brother George guy who's escaped my mind. They were wrestling with that a little bit too.
Yes.
Am I off base by saying that we are there's an anti-intellectual culture taking place today where you can't engage in the things we need to engage like this?
I don't think you're off base at all. And I think we're now in a completely new phase because of the Trump administration. There is no question that, I mean, I ran into this again and again. What happened in history is very much connected to the ideas of Michel Foucault, I think, who said that basically everything that is written down is about power. It's to benefit somebody or else, to give power to somebody else, somebody or other. And the premise of it became that if you wrote about governments, if you were writing about the ruling elite and the decisions they make, you were in some sense buttressing their power simply by giving so much attention to them, and that the job of history now was to revolutionize the discipline and to write about the people who had not been written about and to expose the fallacies of Western civilization, the sexism, racism, homophobia that it had hid and so on. And that so it was that, I mean, the way I got to Williams College in 2006 for 1 year was that a political scientist who taught international relations had gotten a donor to put up the money for a rotating 1 year position to teach some diplomatic history because the history department wasn't doing it anymore. And what I learned later from him was that when he first broached this to the then chairman of the history department, she said, "Why would you want to do that? That's not what historians do anymore." So yes, there has been an instinctive prejudice that I began to run into a little bit, even when I was still in grad school, against traditional subject matter in history. And that just got worse and worse as far as I could see. Now, and that did police the discipline in the same way that similar ideology policed the discipline of literature, which got hit even harder, which is why Camille Paglia, certainly the foremost literary scholar of our generation and an exact contemporary of mine, I'm proud to say. I never did get to know her well, I'm sorry to say. But anyway, never had a job. She had one job in Bennington. She got fired from that. And she spent the rest of her career at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, teaching some liberal arts to art students. And eventually she even got into some trouble there, although she survived that. But now the school doesn't even exist. It collapsed and she's retired. And I'm sorry to say, I don't know what the situation is, but she's dropped off the radar these last few years, which I think is a great loss. But she wrote very effectively in the 90s about what was happening in her discipline. And that was a big eye opener for me in understanding what was happening to mine. And that's why, you see, from 1990 to 2012, I was the member of this outstanding department at the Naval War College in Newport, because it was filled with historians and political scientists who had basically taken refuge there as the climate became so unfavorable in mainstream academia. Yeah.
So it's interesting you point that out, because what we're seeing here is and we know this, there have been different iterations of the culture wars, and this has come up, and I agree, something feels different now. That's
excuse me, I didn't get to that. I mean, now we have an all-out attack on anything that looks left-wing, and particularly with respect to race and gender and DEI. And the federal government is mobilizing its power to do this. And there are lots of ironies to me about all this. I mean, it makes me very sad, but I can remember, okay, as the role of the government expanded in my youth in education and other ways, there were Republicans who argued this is a mistake, because if you're relying on the federal government's money, they're going to tell you what to do. And eventually, you're really going to regret that. And that is what has happened. That is what is happening now. And meanwhile, I'm so unhappy about a lot of other things that have happened in universities, in particular, the huge expansion of administrations. And again, DEI may be one part of that, but it's a very small part of it in the whole scheme of things. I mean, Harvard now has 10 vice presidents. When I was in college, it had none. Okay. And they each have a few people working for them too. I mean, that's just one example. And it goes on and on and on. But now, yes, it's a battleground. But the other thing that's bothered me so much is that the major institutions have lost sight of their educational function, particularly for undergraduates. And thus, I had evidence in the form of student evaluations from the time of my first 3 years of teaching of how effective I could be. And I sent those evaluations in a lot of job applications, and it's not clear any of them ever had any impact at all. And that happens a lot. Whereas, you see, in the Harvard I was at, the Harvard I went to had been created by James Bryan Conant, who was the president until sometime in the mid-50s. And he not only started the general education program of required courses for freshmen, there was some choice, but he hired distinguished faculty to teach those courses. And that's what it takes to really make that program go. But in those days, there were a lot of top schools. I remember doing an interview in Amherst, and this was very clear. They had a deep sense of offering a particular intellectual product. And now, with very rare exceptions, such as the two St. John's colleges and a few other small colleges, that isn't happening. And that's very sad. Yeah.
You know, Professor Kaiser, we're coming to the end of this episode of Race Matters, but I do want to give you the final word, and I want to ask you a question as it relates to this. Historian Lynn Hunt argues about her concerns regarding this this notion of presentism, this sense in the field of history that people are only interested in the late 20th, 21st century, and in doing so, there's been a kind of a rejection of thinking about the broad scopes of history for such thing as just focusing on modern day topical matters such as courses like race, class, and gender. That's there. This kind of fuels some uproar, as we know, among folks within the historical profession. And she's saying, this focus is problematic, right? No one wants to do anything else but talk about the things that I talk about sometimes, just a point to figure out. I'm okay.
Well, not only Lynn Hunt, but unfortunately, I can't remember his name. But the then president of the AHA a couple of years ago raised this question and then felt compelled to apologize for having done so, which was very disappointing to me. But he set off a real firestorm. Well, I think I'm glad you did this because it allows me to make one of my favorite points. Something has happened to history and also to journalism, which is that in contrast to the traditional view that journalism was there to tell you about what was happening and history was there to tell you about what happened in the past, now journalism is there to tell you what should be happening, particularly on the op-ed pages, and history is there to show you what was wrong with the past and how we're so much better than they are and how we can learn what not to do by looking at the past. And again, those approaches have become completely instinctive. And that is part of the reason, I think, that the liberal media is having such a terrible time dealing with Trump. Because everything they write is like, this can't be happening because it's so offensive to me. Well, sorry, but many of your fellow Americans apparently have different views, and it is happening. And the real point of in my opinion, I've come to believe, of history is what Dr. Johnson said was the real point of literature: better to enjoy life and better to endure it. And in a recent blog, I quoted Ronke, the founder of modern history, saying, well, this is my paraphrase of him: we have to recognize that every era of history is equally human. Okay. The way he said it was, God cares just as much about every epoch. As an unbeliever, that's not the way I would put it. But every epoch represents some part of human nature. Now, our current epoch in the United States is not representing the best parts of human nature, but this too shall pass. Again, I've told a lot of people, and a lot of people don't want to hear this. And in fact, my wife and I have had many conversations about this. the first thing you realize about what's happening now is, frankly, there's very little any of us can do about it. And if you can't get that through your head, and well, it's like when somebody close to you is diagnosed with a terminal disease. Okay, yes, it's awful, but it's going to happen to you, and you're going to have to live with it. By that, I don't mean to say that America has a terminal disease. I don't think it does. I think it has a serious disease that has a lot of harm, do a lot of harm, but we'll recover. I mean, if Germany can recover from National Socialism, we can recover from Donald Trump. And yeah,
And that
so that's a good place to leave. But really, Eddie, you've thanked me profusely. I have to thank you just as profusely, because you're just one guy who obviously has a curious mind who happened to come across what I had done. And this does not happen very often. And actually, one of the paradoxes of my career, and I know somebody else who, in this respect, has had a similar career, and she was a colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon, and she's written about a lot of different things. And I said, have you noticed that when you've written about a lot of different things, you never get invited to a conference about any of them? And she said, oh, absolutely. And that's true. It's amazing. But that's what I wanted to do, and I've loved every minute of it, and that's what counts. And actually, I do want to tell you too, because this will encourage me. I've just started a new project, which is going to be an attempt to write a relatively concise history of the controversies about slavery from the Constitutional Convention to the Civil War. And I'm reading a lot and learning a lot, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
my friend,
But really, thank you very much for your curiosity and for reaching out to me, and it was great.
I'm excited about that, and I hope we will continue. And
Sure.
listening, you've got to know that I am, Professor Kaiser, David Kaiser is here because I'm a big fan. Like I said, I'm a kid in a candy store talking to just a phenomenal scholar and historian who loves history and thinking and ideas. And so I invite you to go out and to really flesh out, some of his other works that he's written, because again, there's some other works that I need to read too. And I do want to invite you to read his autobiography, A Life in History. That is just a wonderful read. And I also want to remind you, if I haven't made this clear, that he has a great blog, History Unfolding at Blogspot. And so you can Google that. You can Google Professor David Kaiser, and it will pop up. He has a great YouTube video where he's kind of given a lecture or talk on his book at the
Right.
at the Harvard Coop down in Cambridge. So if you're here and if you're listening, my name is Eddie Carson. This is Race Matters. We've had the honor of having Professor David Kaiser join us into the fold. My friends, until next time, let's just continue to enjoy the good funk. And I will talk to you later. Thank you.